Hi, welcome back to Reading Queen, my fellow bookworms. Today I'm going to be reading, you already know, so, chapter 19 through 21. And now, while Hector is making his way to Petunia, to Holly, he's almost there. But technically it's on Hector's side of the story right now, so. Chapter 19. Hector pounded his fist on the wooden door of the church. Finally, there was a metallic click, and the door swung open. An older boy with long hair stood in the doorway. "Let him in," shouted from behind. Someone shouted from behind. "Holly." Hector pushed his way past the long-haired boy and into the church. He saw her standing with a group of other kids. She was soaked from head to toe, and her clothes and hair were a mess. But it was her, his sister. He had found her. He ran to her and wrapped his arms around her in a big, "I thought I'd never see you again" embrace. "Hector," she said. She sounded relieved. "Unbelievable," another boy said. He looked older, too. His hand was covering his mouth, and he actually looked like he might cry. "We're glad to see you, little man," a girl with rainbow hair said. "Oh," Hector eyed everyone. "Hi." "Right," Holly said. "Everyone, this is my brother Hector." She pointed to each of the other kids in turn. "Hector, this is Petunia, Marco, George, and Javier." There was no way Hector was going to remember all of that. He didn't care. He had found Holly. That's all that mattered. "How did you find me?" Holly asked. Hector pointed to Edmund, who was still standing by the front door. "I found someone who could help." Everyone spun around. There was a sharp intake of breath from more than one person. "That's," Petunia started. "Edmund," Marco finished. Hector stepped closer to Marco. He seemed familiar for some reason. "You know Edmund?" Hector asked. Edmund came forward, water dripping and pooling on the wooden floor beneath his bare feet. He eyed the rafters of the church like an owner returning from a long vacation. "Is the rear door locked as well?" Edmund asked. Kinda," George answered. "Why do you ask?" "Oh," Edmund shrugged. "Hector passed in front of the statue. I imagine we will need to exit through the back." Holly's face turned white. Hector didn't understand. What was Edmund talking about? "Javier!" Holly shouted. "The door! Did you lock the door?" Javier fumbled in his pockets. The door swung open, hitting the doll with a sharp wooden crack. A woman entered. She wore a black dress. Her long dark hair was wet and tangled and covered her face like a bramble of wild thorns. Everyone froze in place. The woman dripped, her chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. Her eyes glowed, giving the hair draped over her face a red tint. "Red eyes," Hector realized, "just like the wolf." They needed to run. They needed to get out. But the woman moved first. She tossed her head back, flinging her long hair out of her eyes. She walked toward them, her steps unhurried, even elegant. She lifted a hand, not so much reaching for them, but extending it like an offer, like she expected them to take it. George and Petunia stumbled backward. Holly grabbed a hold of Hector's arm, pulling him close. The older boy, Marco, stepped in front of them. Edmund was already at the far end of the church. Slipping into a room in the back, Javier leapt forward. "Yarg!" he shouted. He flung his arms, tossing his net into the air. The net spread out, spreading stretching like a spider web, sailing above the woman in black and landing on her head. The net draped over her. She tried to push it off, but one of her arms slipped through a hole, tangling her. She stumbled forward and tripped, dropping to her knees. She shook, trying to free herself, her movements becoming wild and frantic. "That's not going to hold her for long," Holly said. Javier grabbed one end of the net. He pulled it tight, trying to pin it to the ground. "George," he yelled. "George, help me." "Javier, don't!" George shouted. He was backing away. "Drop the stupid net." Marco grabbed Holly and Hector by the arm. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." "George," Javier screamed, "get over here. Come here and help me, you coward." Beneath the net, the woman in black trembled. Her convulsing was rapid and violent, like the frenzied vibration of the wings of a locust. She cast her head back, exposing her neck, and then she shed her skin. Her entire outer layer, skin, hair, clothes, and all faded in one color and peeled away. It was like a flower blossoming and then rotting all at once. From beneath the discarded husk of the woman emerged a snake. Its scales were glassy black, its eyes glowing red, and its fangs bared and ready to strike. The snake slipped easily through the holes of the net. "Run!" Marco shouted, but it was too late. I thought the shedding part was disgusting, but yeah. I really like snakes. I don't like when they shed very much. Well, anyways, chapter 20. The snake coiled and sprang at Javier. In mid-lunge, it seemed to burst apart, changing in an instant back into a woman. She landed on Javier, shoving him into the ground. She smacked a hand down on top of his face, clutching it like she was gripping a ball. Javier opened his mouth, but he didn't even have time to scream. His face had already turned to stone. "No!" George shouted. Gray soon covered Javier's body, spreading down from his head like a slowly dripping coat of molten wax. He lay still on his back, motionless, his arms outstretched uselessly in defense. In just seconds, he had become a lifeless statue, his expression stuck in a look of anguished shock. The woman in black collapsed. She dropped to her knees, resting her hand on the floor, almost like she was praying. Holly remembered she had done this before, when she turned Max to stone. Turning kids into statues took something out of her. It seemed to make her tired. What's happening?" Hector stammered, his eyes bulging in horror. Holly realized this must have been the first time Hector had seen the wind transform, but there was no time to explain. "We have to go," Holly said. "We have to go now." Marco began to edge around the woman in black. Toward the front door, she lunged and swiped at his leg, barely missing him. "Hector!" Edmund shouted. He was at the back of the church, behind the altar, standing in front of an open door. Itch crawled forward, swiping at them again, holding her fingers out like claws. She wasn't going to let them escape out the front. Their only choice was to follow Edmund. "Let's go," Holly said. She pulled Hector with her as she backed away. George stood in place, refusing to move. Petunia went to him, clutching his arm. "You have to leave. Come on." George let himself be moved, but never took his eyes off Javier. They ran down the aisle to the room at the back of the church. Marco slammed the door shut behind them. He fumbled with the knob. "There's no lock," he said. The room was tiny. There was a wooden desk tucked into one corner and a wardrobe standing against the far wall. On the back wall, there was another door, presumably leading outside. A tall, empty bookshelf was propped up against it, blocking their exit. "That bookshelf may present a problem," Edmund remarked, as if their situation was a particularly challenging puzzle and not a matter of life and death. Marco yanked at the bookshelf, trying to move. "It's too heavy," he grunted. Petunia went over to help, and the two of them pulled up the bookshelf together, their faces red with exertion. "Everyone," he said through gritted teeth, "help!" They all rushed over to help Marco and Petunia, all except Edmund, who stood apart, watching with his head tilted slightly to the side. Holly gripped the bookcase and heaved with everything she had. The wood was thick and sturdy, but she could feel it beginning to scrape forward. Little more," Petunia said through clenched teeth. Finally, Holly felt the weight of the bookshelf shift, its top tilting away from the door. For a moment, it stood perfectly on edge. Then it tipped forward, crashing to the ground. It landed with a crack. "Go," Holly panted. "Let's go." Edmund was first to the door. He pulled it, but it only opened a small bit before it stopped, slamming into something solid and wooden. The bottom of the fallen bookcase was right in front of the door, still blocking it. There was only a narrow opening, just big enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. Edmund quickly slipped through without a look back. Before anyone else could move, though, there was a loud, hollow thump from behind. The witch had entered the room. She held one hand against the wall, leaning against it. She seemed to still be weak, not fully recovered, but she strode forward anyway. She outstretched an arm, fingers opening and closing, grasping. She was right there, right in front of them, and there was no way they could all make it through the door fast enough. Marco turned to Holly and Hector. "Protect each other," he said to them. "What?" Holly asked. Marco gazed at her with wide, gentle, almost apologetic eyes. He looked so much like Mom, she realized. "And remember us this time." He gave Holly a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. Okay. Then Marco ran toward it. He leaped on top of her, knocking her down. "Go!" he screamed. "Go! Go!" And his last words were swallowed as his body faded into stone. We're losing people pretty fast here. Like, I don't know what they're into, like. Does it have, like, no mercy or something? What's even happening? That was an intense chapter. But moving on to the last chapter of today's video. Chapter 21. Marco! Petunia screamed. "Come on!" George pulled at Holly and Hector, who were too shocked to move. "Don't let it be for nothing." Behind them, the witch shivered and moaned. She was still on the ground, next to the statue of Marco. George pushed Hector through the narrow gap in the door, then quickly followed. "We have to leave him." Petunia's eyes welled with tears. She took Holly's hand and led her outside to join the others. There was a small drop from the door to the grass outside, and Holly almost tripped as she stumbled out. As soon as she and Petunia were outside, George slammed the door shut. It was still night. The rain had cleared, and the sky was illuminated by a sea of stars and a bright full moon. They were in a small, fenced-in area behind the church. The ground was overgrown with tall grass. It grew wild among small stone markers. A graveyard. Edmund faced them. His demeanor was unnaturally calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. "She will likely be out shortly," he said. He raised his eyebrows. There was a hint of smile at the corner of his lips. "We should hide." Something knocked against the back door of the church. There was scratching, the nails clawing on wood. "That's her," Petunia whispered, her voice quivering. "This way," Edmund said. He walked into the graveyard. A tiny gurgle escaped his mouth. "I've a secret. Hector knows." Holly gave Hector a "what the heck does that mean" look. "It's okay," Hector said. "I think I know what he's talking about." They followed Edmund. He bent his head low as he walked among the gravestones. All of them cluttered in uneven rows. The names and dates on the stones had been weathered and worn down by time, but some Holly could still make out. A first name, Constant, a date of birth, 1699. There was a loud, throaty grunt behind them, and then the thump-thump of something heavy moving behind the back door. "Here we are." Edmund squatted next to a gravestone. There was a name on it, Thaddeus Valens, and a date, 1702 to 1739. The ground in front of the marker was covered in leaves and twigs. Edmund reached down and pulled the mass of branches up all at once. Holly saw now they were bundled together, and beneath was a wide, dark hole. It looked just like a grave. Edmund slid into the hole and crouched down, disappearing. "He wants us to hide in there?" Petunia gulped. "In someone's grave?" Before Holly could respond, a chilling howl filled the air. Holly looked, and it was just as she feared. It was out of the church. She was in her wolf form, her eyes casting a red glow. Quickly, they all tumbled in the hole together. The space wasn't big enough for all of them, and they all wedged inside, over and on top of one another, a mass of sweaty and tangled limbs. At last, Edmund managed to reach his hand up and pull up the bundled branches back over their heads. The air was warm and suffocating. Bodies pressed against Holly, forcing her to shift and squirm. She lost her balance, falling on someone else's back. She reached down to steady herself, and her hand closed against something smooth and solid. A bone. Had she just touched somebody's skull? Had she just wrapped her hand around the remains of Thaddeus Valens? Holly swallowed her urge to scream. There were sounds from above. Paws on the grass. A searching, steady growl. She's right above us. Holly felt sweat dripping down her cheek. She could hear someone. Hector? George? Taking shallow, ragged breaths. If I can hear them, so can she, Holly thought, but she didn't care to warn them. She couldn't speak. She was only crouched in the dark and the dirt, hoping it didn't find them, praying that she hadn't crawled into her own grave. Claws scratched overhead. A single twig fell, landing on Holly's back. Then something else, a soft sound close by. Someone was whistling. It was a slow, sad song, each note sustained so long it seemed to be yearning for release, desperate for whatever came next. What could that be? Holly wondered. Then came the sound of feathers rustling, of wings beating the air, of a raven calling into the night. Edmund stood and threw off the canopy of leaves. "Ha!" he said, peering up at the sky. He looked pleased. Holly disentangled herself from the others, and they all pushed and shoved as they hurried to climb out. "Worst hiding spot ever," Petunia grunted. They gathered around the tombstone, dusting themselves off, and Edmund placed the cover of the hole over the hole once more. Petunia and Hector were looking around nervously, but George had his eyes locked on the church. "We should go back," George said. "Wait, what?" Holly blurted out. "That's crazy." "No, it's safe," George said. "We survived for months in that church." He then took his glasses off and covered his eyes. "Oh, God, Javier, I can't believe." Petunia went to him and gently put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." She gave Holly a soft look. "We know what you're going through." Now it was Holly's turn to stare sadly back at the church. Marco was in there. She had lost him, and lonely just after learning who he really was. There was so much she had wanted to ask him. She couldn't get his last words out of her mind. "Remember us this time." She felt she felt emptiness in her gut, like something precious and vital had been stolen from her. No, not just from her, from Hector too. Hector approached Holly, looking worried. "Are you okay?" How was she supposed to explain this to him? How she could tell them they had brothers they didn't even remember, and now they were gone? "No," she answered. "I'm not. No, I don't want to stay here anymore." George brushed Petunia's hand off his shoulder. "Where should we go then? Where else is safe?" "I don't know." Holly threw her arms up. "I mean, this is Covenant, right? There has to be more than just a church around here." "Of course there is," Edmund said. "Much more." Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Holly asked. "The town is that way," Edmund said, pointing through the forest. He smiled. "Do you want to go?" The end of the story. Just kidding. Obviously not. Now we're done. It is dark outside and I want to go back in my house, so thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. If you did, make sure you like, subscribe, turn on notifications maybe, and share your friends for more awesome videos like this. Bye!